Hi, I'm Peter Van Zandt Lane. While we're all cloistered away from our classes and our ensembles for the social distancing measures, I thought I would make a few videos that just dig into some of the more salient features of some of my compositions. So the first piece I'd like to talk about is Astrarium, a composition for wind ensemble that I composed in 2015 that was commissioned by the Emory Wind Ensemble and Nick Pilato. The four features of this piece that I'd like to discuss include musical quotation, counterpoint, rhythmic process, and form. By the way, if you'd like to view the full score or hear the recording, check out the links below in the description section. The first bit on musical quotation requires a little bit of backstory. I was on a residency in a place called MacDowell Colony, a really cool artist retreat in New Hampshire where you basically get your own cabin and a bunch of time to focus on writing. There's a tradition there where the artists who are in residence sign these wooden boards inside the studio. Just as I was starting the piece, an opener for Joseph Schwantner's new piece, I coincidentally found his signature on the wall inside my studio, signed in the mid-1970s. I wrote to the ensemble director to find out what he was writing in the same studio as me 40 years earlier. It turned out to be a song cycle of texts by Ursula Le Guin. I decided to quote a short phrase from the piece, the entrance of the soprano in the first movement. In Astrarium, I used this quote as something like a secondary theme, first appearing in an oboe solo at rehearsal B. Here I've maintained the original whole tone quality of the harmony, giving the section a quality of being suspended in time. Fast forward to the second half of the piece. The Schwantner quote appears again here, but in a different harmonic context and as a fugue. This brings us to our second element I'd like to talk about, counterpoint. Contemporary music gives us a lot of leeway to break the rules, and despite my love for tonal counterpoint, and especially counterpoint from the Renaissance, I have a lot of fun playing around with canon and fugue techniques where basically anything goes with respect to consonance and dissonance. In rehearsal F of Astrarium, the Schwantner quote comes back in a clarinet solo, but the harmony isn't whole tone anymore, it's in C Dorian. Now, the whole tone fragment stretches in range of an augmented fourth, so unless I want to distort the intervals of the melody, it only fits into one place in C Dorian, and that's starting on the 5th scale degree, concert G, where it shows up in the solo clarinet. After that, the subject is altered to fit in different parts of the mode. In old fugues, this is called a tonal answer, as opposed to a real answer where the interval qualities are maintained. Now, before the clarinet's quote is finished, the oboe starts the quote on D, and then the alto sax on concert B flat, and then the flute on F, and so on. This technique is called stretto. It's where the subject in a fugue is answered before the initial statement is complete. It can be really tricky when abiding by traditional Baroque standards, but it's really fun and probably much easier in a contemporary pan-diatonic language such as this, where passing dissonances are acceptable so long as things generally flow around the same key. One important feature of the way I transcribed Joseph Schwantner's melody was to keep the first ornamentation in the line here on the beat and put the second ornamentation here off the beat. When the stretto fugue gets really dense, at its peak there's 11 subjects going on all at once, these two ornaments can interlock into an almost steady stream of 16th notes. By blending these composite ornaments into a steady flow of 16th runs, I can lift us out of the section in an emotionally satisfying climactic way. Let's listen to the whole fugue. next feature I'd like to discuss is rhythmic process. This is a technique I use in a lot of my music, and probably a lot more gratuitously in other pieces than this one. But in Astrarium, there's one place where I employ a rhythmic collapsing process, which signals the end of a section. Backing up a little bit, one of the main themes in this piece can be heard as a melody in the clarinets and saxophones in rehearsal A. Near the end of the piece, a variation on this motive becomes an ostinato for a more gritty, tense section leading towards the climactic end of the piece. The ostinato climbs higher in register and eventually peaks out in G Dorian. From there, we can't go up anymore. The tuba part here is already super mean, sorry tubas. So instead of going higher, the ostinato collapses rhythmically. It repeats over and over, each time removing an eighth note value from one or more of its longer notes, until it's crushed down into straight eighth notes, which is, I'm hoping, its most recognizable form from when we heard it earlier in the piece. Let's listen. Incidentally, all of this is happening underneath an octatonic scale, which turns out to play nicely with this Dorian motive. But I'll talk about that more in a different video on another wind ensemble piece of mine, Hive Mind. The hope here is that it creates a ton of tension leading into the end of the piece, making the big open restatement of the fanfare from the middle of the piece sound satisfying and conclusive. That brings us to the last thing I'd like to talk about in this piece, its form. Astrarium doesn't follow a particular formal standard, but it does have some features of traditional rondo forms. I've outlined a large-scale formal map here. You can also download this chart from the link in the description section. In short, there's an opening of a few swelling chords, an A section that features a somewhat jazzy theme in Dorian, a B section with the Schwantner quote, some development, and then a really dramatic, over-the-top rallentando into a short brass fanfare. Let's listen to that brass fanfare, because it's really important. After that, we have our fugue on the Schwantner quote, a descending sequence featuring the oboes that's in part transition and in part a response to the rising fugue, what goes up must come down, a tense collapse of the material from the A section, and finally a dramatic closing of the piece. An interesting point here is that big fanfare we just listened to, when I was planning out the piece, I wanted to write a tiny brass fanfare with a big ornate frame. I was kind of thinking of triptychs or some tiny art with big frames. But the general idea of the piece as a whole is that when the fanfare arrives in the middle of the piece, it towers over the rest of the piece, at least in terms of how musically dramatic it is. Another important formal element is what I'd call an iconic precadence. This is a little bit of music that signals the end of a section in a very recognizable way. Here it is left open in the middle of rehearsal C. And it only appears one more time. Here it is at the end of the piece, leading to the final bar. I'd like to end by posing a couple of open-ended questions. I didn't talk at all about the title. I originally titled this piece Wild Angles, which was a play on words with Schwantner's Wild Angels of the Open Hills. The Astrarium was an old mechanical astronomical clock dating from the 14th century, and I switched the title near the end of writing the piece after noticing all the clock sounds I used in the piece, and as the question of time became more important to me. So my first question is, when you hear clock-like sounds in the piece, how does it affect how the music is paced? Does it seem to move faster, slower, or the same speed as if the clock sounds weren't there at all? In particular, I'd be interested how these clock sounds affect the listener at rehearsal G, measures 137 through 175. Second question. Earlier I said I conceived the piece as a tiny fanfare with a large ornate frame. In grad school I studied with the brilliant composer and musical thinker Martin Boykin, who I think would be very critical of this idea. He talks a lot about what he calls the visual fallacy, which you can read more about in his book Silence in Slow Time. Essentially, he argues that many composers fall into the trap of conceiving of music as an asynchronous object, something that can be seen all at once rather than something that we experience over time. I think he'd say that we can't hear the fanfare as the center of the piece because the narrative of the music places it into the context of a line of themes that are already developing before the fanfare and continue developing after it. If this is truly the case, personally, I can't help but feel that the fanfare is underdeveloped, overdramatic, and completely absurd. This is something that really nags at me about the piece, but to be honest, I have something that nags at me about all of my pieces, so there it is. My second question is, do you hear the fanfare as the centerpiece of Astrarium despite its short length? Does the idea of a fanfare with an ornate frame make musical sense to you, or have I fallen victim to the visual fallacy? That's it. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to shoot me an email or send me any of your responses, I'd love to read them. You can contact me through the contact form on my website, petervanzandtlane.com. Special thanks to Elise Rosniai, who gave me permission to use her performance of Wild Angels of the Open Hills, and special thanks to Tomo Matsuo and the Osakan Philharmonic Winds for their performance and recording of Astrarium at the 2019 Midwest Clinic in Chicago. That's all. Hopefully I'll catch you at the next video.